On the program today, Kenya to restrict second-hand imports to boost domestic car sector. South African consumer confidence holds steady. Plus, Russia's Alrosa and Chinese-owned Anjin chosen to mine Zimbabwe diamonds. Very many thanks for joining us and welcome to Business Incorporated. I'm Imana Amawe. Let's get the show started with some of the markets we track here in Africa. Well, first from here in Nigeria, bullish sentiments dominated at the local bourse as at intraday, the benchmark index was up 0.30%. The Egypt Stock Exchange also traded in the green at intraday, gaining 0.24%. However, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange was in red territory as at intraday, edging lower by 72 basis points. And it's mixed sentiments in the Middle East markets today, with Abu Dhabi and the Qatar Stock Exchange coming in positive at intraday, gaining 0.97% and 0.58% respectively. On the flip side, the Dubai FM shed 0.10%, while the Saudi Stock Exchange inched lower by 0.29%. And the European stock markets were slightly lower in morning trade as uncertainty continues to dominate investors' sentiment. Investors will be closely monitoring an interest rate decision by the European Central Bank today. But first, let's cross over to the Frankfurt Stock Exchange, where my colleague Conrad is all set to bring us up to speed with developments there. Hello, Conrad. Just in a few minutes, the European Central Bank will be updating its key interest rates, and later this afternoon, the ECB President Mario Draghi is expected to speak on the slowdown on the EU economy. What are the expectations on the trading floor?
Well, yes, no one here on the trading floors is expecting at the moment any changes in terms of interest rates. So let me just remind you where we are in the Eurozone in terms of interest rates. 0% interest banks have to pay for the so-called MRO, which is the main refinancing operations. That's the interest you pay on, or banks pay, when they borrow money from the European Central Bank over 1 week. When banks borrow from the Central Bank overnight, they have to pay 0.25% interest, or 0.25%. For money that banks deposit at an account they have at the Central Bank overnight, they have to pay also interest, and the negative interest rate that is here on this on the deposits at the European Central Bank is 0.4%. Everyone, 100% of people on the markets believe that this is where we are going to stay also after today's press conference, after the announcements, and after today's meeting of the European Central Bank's Council. What's not so clear is the outlook of Mario Draghi and the economy, given the recent slowdown of the economy in the Eurozone. What's the impact of this on the inflation outlook? What's the impact of this on the expectation which many people on the markets have had so far, that this year the European Central Bank would increase interest rates eventually? The current data we've been getting from purchasing managers index and indices is not indicating that it's very likely that we're going to see higher interest rates. Most of all, the purchasing managers index from the German manufacturing sector came as a very negative surprise. For the first time since November 2014, this index has slipped below 50, and that, as you know, Emana, indicates a contraction in this sector.
Okay, very well indeed. In the corporate sector now, the car industry is in focus once again with the announcement of Nissan Renault chief Carlos Ghosn's resignation by the French finance minister at Davos. There's also some bad news from Ford and Hyundai. Tell us more, Conrad.
Well, the sector is really in big trouble, and the fact that Carlos Ghosn is in custody in Japan, and according to the French Minister of Finance, Bruno Le Maire, who is in Davos right now, where he said that Carlos Ghosn will have to resign as chief of Renault. Now Ghosn has more or less lost all of his posts, Nissan and Renault. But Carlos Ghosn and his taking into custody is just a juicy detail, if I may call it that, of the whole trouble that the car sector is in, the whole huge change that the sector is facing. Today, Ford Motor Company reported about a quarterly loss during the fourth quarter of 2018. Ford only managed a slight profit on the US-American market. All of the other markets for Ford produced negative numbers, a loss there. And Hyundai, the car maker based in South Korea, reported a loss as well, the first one in 8 years. Hyundai actually managed to increase the total numbers of cars it managed to sell, but it spent so much money on marketing and other stuff that, it didn't turn out a profit. The outlook that Hyundai has been giving today for the whole year is also rather bleak. Hyundai is blaming the US-American-China trade spat and, of course, a slowdown in China for this bleak outlook.
All right, let's switch gears very quickly now. The political rift in Venezuela is widening and the standoff is reaching far beyond the borders of that country. What's the general reaction across Europe? And why hasn't this had much impact on the price of oil?
It's really fascinating to see that despite, the quarrels between the Maduro regime in Venezuela and the US administration, the United States is still the #1 customer when it comes to oil from Venezuela. Business in terms of oil seems to go on. And at the same time, on the political level, you have, those quarrels between the Venezuelan government, Maduro, and the US, and you have more. And that is really something that many people here in Europe are talking about. You do not only have the Americans involved in Venezuela, but also the Russians. While Maduro is really the big enemy of Donald Trump and his administration, he's very chummy with Vladimir Putin. And it really looks like, just like in the Cold War times when the USSR, Russia, and the US, on the other hand, had their proxy wars. They seem to have another proxy war here in Venezuela, like, for example, also in Syria. And that's really a big concern for people here because they are reminded of what's been going on in the Cold War. And they are reminded that those ideologies are still playing a very important role, especially in the US administration, where, with the administration under President Obama, everyone had hoped that America would have overcome this old black and white thinking. That's really a concern. And what's also a concern is, of course, that this explosive mixture in Venezuela, there's one a group of people that really has to pay the highest price for this, and this is ordinary people in Venezuela and in the neighboring country. So many people already have fled Venezuela because of the political turmoil there.
Very many thanks, Conrad. Keeping an eye for us there from Frankfurt. Well, that will be it now from the European market.